You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is Tuesday evening. Tuesday being the day after Monday. That's how swift my brain is working today. You like that? I'm on top of my game. And so I want to welcome you to my show. This is Scotty Roberts, and you're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. Sorry, I was just adjusting something back in my studio behind me. I had a hat rack that was tipping over a little bit. Not sure why. But if you're not watching the live video over on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, where you can watch the simulcast of this show and join the live chat room. If you aren't there already, then you didn't see that little set adjustment in the background. And yeah, it's a set. This is my office. This is my studio. Way over on that wall, I've got all my bookshelves. Well, some of them. I've got a lot of boxes of books still over there. We had moved into this little tighter location that we hope to be out of by the end of the year, next year, and into a bigger place. But so everything around here, it's my art studio, it's my research, it's where I write. My computer to record this show is set up right on my drawing table, my huge-ass drafting table. It's all at an angle, so I've got to get everything set just right. And so there's some mundane out of the way for you today. So welcome to my studio. Welcome to my mind, my life, the things I like to talk about. As I said way at the beginning of launching this show over on Odyssey Radio Network, is that I talk about and do things that I like to do. These are all the things that excite me about life, that history and alternate history, and digging into things a little deeper, and certain topics that you've heard me talk about. So we're going to do some more of that today. Again, I'm a little slow in the wit department today, as well as the talking department, but I'm still here and I can still do this. I can still talk. So just feeling still a little bit under the weather, and it's gone from chest cold to head cold to throat cold back to head cold, and so I'm a little stuffy and I'm a little all of that, but you all experience that, and so you'll have to put up with my little bit of physical, mental setback for today. I'm a little, what would they call it? You know, when you get, I'm not dizzy, but I am lightheaded today, and my body doesn't want me to walk around too much. So it's one of those days. And hopefully in a few days, before the end of this week, we'll be getting back to normal. And I can be my general, usual, effervescent, buoyant self. And dig into serious topics that way. So all of that to say, thanks for being here. I appreciate your presence here. I appreciate that you take your time to be here. And so now, with no further fanfare, and what would you call it? Unimportant trivia about my day and my surroundings and my life. I'd turn the camera around, by the way, and just show you this whole office. It's a bit of a disaster. My wife has her desk over there where she does all of her creative stuff. I got mine here and there, and my books everywhere. So, as I mentioned, but to do that, I'd have to pick up the laptop and swerve everything around. It's just not going to work. And it wouldn't benefit the people listening on the radio. So there you go. And that's enough of my banter. Let's get into the topic. And yesterday we took a little detour and we talked about Columbus. And I thought that this was a great topic for yesterday because I've talked about Native American issues before. And I hope, as some of you mentioned in the chat room last night during this show, you talked about you had some relatives that really detested Columbus and Columbus Day. And I hope that last night's show was just a little a touch on historical information that might counter some of the nastiness that's been said about Columbus. Was he a perfect man? No, not by far. Did he make mistakes? Sure. But he was not the genocidal, xenophobic maniac that some of the radical activists have tried to paint him to be. Columbus Day is just fine to honor the man Columbus for what he did. And once you get an understanding of the kind of person he was, that the nastinesses attributed to him, the evils attributed to him, weren't all him. And he had a very different character than what is painted about him in revisionist history. So hopefully you enjoyed that last night. But now we're off of that detour. Let's jump back into what we were talking about this whole topic about Jesus and Jesus being a pagan god-man, Jesus being the same type of character as many messiahs who came before him. How lots of, and I hope you're beginning to see, how lots of the information that we have about Jesus is really identical to the information that was attributed to other god figures, god-man figures, throughout ancient history, prior to the time of Jesus. And so it starts to look like Jesus gained a lot of his attributes about who he was, about his ministry, about the deeds he did, about his God-man status, by those who were very inculcated into the pagan mysteries and knew these other characters and attributed them, pulled them up and said, if you want this Jesus to be anything credible, maybe you should attach to him some of the attributes that we have found throughout the ages with these older Osiris, Dionysus, Bacchus, Mithras, all these different characters that we've talked about. And so this is what Jesus became, I think. Now, here's the big question. For Christians, does that eradicate the salvific nature and message of Jesus? Did Jesus come preaching a message of accept me into your hearts and become worthy of heaven? Does that negate what we were taught about his shed blood on the cross and his death and resurrection as being the way to get to God? That's a big question that we're going to tackle along the way here. And trust me, I am going to, along the way, also present the opposite side of this argument. And so I want you to be able to decide for yourself. I want you to be able to go look this stuff up and go read it. So another question that's asked, and somebody asked me, are we just abandoning Christianity then to take up this older religion, if you will, this older spirituality, to replace it? And in a way, that's what you end up doing when you look at this stuff and say, wait a minute, maybe Jesus isn't what we were taught he was. Maybe he isn't who we were taught he was. Maybe he is just a mythic, allegorical character. Just like the other, maybe he existed. I think most of these characters had some kernel of truth at the core. But are they all gods? Are they all, or were they meant to be people that we viewed that way in order to introduce us to the deeper mysteries of who we are? That we are truly all gods. And of course, all of this flies in the face of what I was taught while I was growing up in the church, the Baptist church, the fundamental conservative, hyper-fundamental Baptist church. And while it contradicts that stuff, it makes me think about what I was taught. So that's why I'm presenting this. I don't have an answer for you that I'm going to give right at this moment because I want you to take the information and mull it over. Now, we kind of left off. We were talking about the birth of Jesus. I'm just going to recap so we can pull ourselves into where we are now with this. And Jesus was born in the stable or in the cave, and in the mysteries of Dionysus, a sacred marriage from which will issue the divine child was performed in the Bucolion, or the ox stall. And the word is usually translated as stable. In the Gospels, it's katalemna, which literally means a temporary shelter or a cave. So even with the place of Jesus' birth, the humble cowshed, the stall, the stable, the barn, the cave where the animals were kept, all of these things tie back to older deities that had same types of things connected to them. And it was widespread early Christian tradition that Jesus was born in a cave. And it wasn't like, hey, go hit the cave out back, the innkeeper said. It was probably a cave that was connected to the family dwelling or the inn's dwelling. And this is where we keep the donkeys and the cows and the sheep and stuff like that. So we got the cave out there. We got the stall, the stable. And so that's a very ancient image, the stable. And the cave is the womb of the Mother Earth, was the mystical picture, the word picture. There were caves that were sacred to the Greek god Pan, and another one for Dionysus, who was also born in a cave. If you remember King Arthur, who was not a god-man, but part of the mythology of Arthur was that he was born at Tintagel, on the beach at the mouth of the cave, Merlin's cave, at the cliffs down below the castle of Tintagel. And so, which is much later than the actual legends, but they have found archaeologically older ruins beneath. And so that was attached. The cave had some sacred meaning. He was the womb of the mother, the earth mother. The Persians, their god Mithras, was said to have been born in a cave. According to Orphic myths, Dionysus was also born in a cave where he was immediately enthroned as the king of the world. You see how they borrowed some of that for the Arthurian legend. Here is born the king of all England, and he's born in a cave. The baby Jesus is visited by the 3 wise men at his birth and 3 shepherds. And in the Gospels, the wise men are actually called the Magi. The Magi were followers of the Persian mystery godman Mithras. Now remember, it said the wise men saw his star in the east, meaning they come from a different place. They came from out east. And that's where they were. They were in Persia. And the Magi were followers of the Persian god-man, Mithras. Mithras' birthday is celebrated on the 25th of December. And this is where they plugged in Jesus' birthday. Why would they do that? Why would his followers plug that date in? It's because, as we talked about a long time ago in here, that the church was trying to assimilate the pagan religions to attract the pagans to them. And so there were a lot of assimilations and a lot of things added. There's a lot of historical hints that the biblical Jesus, be he fiction or be he real, was born at a time that was close to Passover, making it the spring. Because when you had the shepherds that close in to the city of Bethlehem, they had the flocks coming in for Passover. That's the only time of the year they would have been that close in. And they saw the star, and they went over to the stable to see the baby, according to the story. And so, because they had the angelic host telling them, lo, unto you is born in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. Now, the city of David is different from Bethlehem. City of David was David's city in Jerusalem, where you can go today, the old Jerusalem, the old part of the town. So that just occurred to me in talking about that. Unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. Now, they could also be referring to Bethlehem, as that's supposed to be where King David was born as well. We'll hit that another time when I can dig into that a little better linguistically. And so these three wise men visit Jesus on his birthday. And even Mithras was said to have been witnessed at his birth by three shepherds. It's another similarity. The Magi bring all these gifts to Jesus of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And you remember I talked about this a little bit last week. The pagan sage Empedocles speaks of worshiping God with offerings of unmixed myrrh and frankincense, casting down also on the ground libations of golden honey. So myrrh was used as a sacred incense during the festival of Adonis. In some myths, he was said to have been born from a myrrh tree. In others, his mother's name itself is myrrh, which almost looks linguistically like a version of Mary. So Jesus was said to have been born in Bethlehem. We talked about this. The house of bread was the meaning of the name Bethlehem. And there's an intriguing fact that Bethlehem was shaded by a grove, an ancient sacred grove to the mystery god-man Adonis, who is regarded as a god of grain and represented by bread. If you remember, if you listened closely or you studied any of this, all through the Old Testament, in Israel prior to the time of Jesus, God was always telling the prophets to burn down the sacred groves of Baal and Asherah, and all the sacred groves of these several unnamed deities that the people would worship, because it was against Jehovah worship. And so God was constantly telling the people to cleanse themselves from this and to burn down the groves, chop them down, take them down. You have Gideon, who went in and chopped down the Asherah pole and things like that and burned the sacred groves. So Bethlehem had its own grove to the god Adonis. And in the Jesus story, the three wise men find Jesus in Bethlehem by following a star in the sky. And the mysteries of Adonis in ancient Antioch were celebrated by cries that the star of salvation has dawned in the east. And this was the morning star, which is actually the planet Venus. And Venus is one of the names for the goddess who in certain myths is the consort of Osiris Dionysus. And in Egypt she was called Isis. For millennia she was associated with the bright star Sirius at the feet of the constellation of Orion, which represented Orion was Osiris. And the first appearance of Sirius was a yearly omen, which announced the rising of the floodwaters of the Nile, the inundation period every year where the Nile flooded, which was associated with the world-renewing power of Osiris. And thus the star foretold the coming of the Lord. St. Epiphanius tells us that in Alexandria, the birth of Osiris Dionysus was Aeon, A-I-O-N, and he was celebrated on the 6th of January. The previous night, the temple was alive with the sound of flutes and singing, reaching its height at cockcrow. And by the way, the 6th of January, I believe, is, remember I have mentioned that my stepfather, when I was a little boy, had, it was Ukrainian, and Ukrainian Orthodox. And I believe the 6th of January is the Ukrainian Christmas. They don't hold it on the same day. And now it might fall on different days of the year, depending on which year you're in. But 6th of January, that just hit my mind too, that is when about the time of Ukrainian Christmas in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is like the Eastern Orthodox. And so the highlight of this whole mystery celebration was the announcement, today at this hour, the Virgin Kore, K-O-R-E, has given birth to Aeon. And so St. Epiphanius must have found this a perplexing coincidence, for along with many of the other early Christians, he celebrated the same date, the 6th of January, as the birth date of Jesus, as does the Armenian Church in the present day, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox. And it's interesting about how you start seeing all these alignments of these dates and these different things that were applied to the ancient gods now being applied to Jesus. So there was quite a dispute, by the way, in early Christianity about whether the birth of Jesus was 25th of December or the 6th of January. Was this because nobody could remember? Or could it simply be because early Christians were unsure whether to synchronize it with the birth of Mithras or with the birth of Aeon? So both of whom were different representations of the perennial mystery God-man. So you see, even in the church, there was difficulty deciding on the date because they needed to know which one of the ancient mystery gods to align Jesus with. So these dates weren't arbitrarily chosen. Both were the dates of the winter solstice, the shortest day, which signals the turning point of the year and the returning of the life-giving sun. And due to the precession of the equinoxes, this date slightly changes over time. So although the solstice moved from progressively the 6th of January to December 25th, some traditions continued it, and they continued to celebrate it on the familiar night. Today it falls around the 22nd of December. And so the annual celebration of the Nativity of the Mystery God-man celebrated the death of the old year and its miraculous rebirth as the new year on the date of the solstice. So Osiris Dionysus represented and was represented by the sun, as was Jesus, whom the church father Clement of Alexandria, of Alexander, calls the Son, S-U-N, of righteousness. And by way of balance, Dionysus, Virgin Mother, Semele, derives her name from the virgin moon goddess Selene. And the angel Gabriel, who comes to Mary to announce the birth of Jesus, was likewise equated with the moon, which you see in many of the paintings of the Virgin Mary. So we're at the end of the first hour, first period, I was going to say. Did you hear the bell ring? I'm going to go out for 2 minutes. We'll be right back. Sit tight. All right, welcome back after the break. I appreciate your coming back and coming here to listen and join in. You're listening to me, Scotty Roberts, on my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And that's at odyssey1.com, ODYSY1.com. And you can also join the simulcast over on my YouTube channel, where you can watch this broadcast. Not that it's super exciting and there's lots of action footage and things like that, but there's also a live chat room that goes along with the video presentation, simulcast. So you can come on over to Mr. Scotty Roberts over on YouTube and listen in, watch, join the chat room, add your thoughts to the discussion. Appreciate your being here. Now let's jump back into this. We left off very quickly with this whole thing about the dates of December 25th, January 6th, and so on, and the comparisons of the birth of Jesus. That was the nativity that we started last week and we left off with. Now let's jump up a little bit and let's talk about some of the other things around Jesus. Let's look at baptism and the baptism of Jesus. If you remember this story, Jesus' mission begins with his baptism. And he was baptized by none other than his cousin, John the Baptist. Now, mythologists such as Joseph Campbell, who wrote, amongst many other books, one that I've got sitting right over here, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, Joseph Campbell have seen the ancient mythological motifs behind this story of the baptism. Campbell himself wrote this. He said, the rite of baptism was an ancient rite coming down from the old Sumerian temple city Eridu. If you remember Eridu, we've talked about Eridu before. Not to rabbit trail, but it was King Atrahasis of Eridu who sought the help of the god Enki to help deliver the the humans, from bondage to the Anunnaki gods. And Enki rose up out of the serpent's den, the snake-infested backwaters of the Euphrates around the city of Eridu. And he showed Atrahasis how to win their freedom from the gods. And for this he was cast down to the subterranean caverns of the earth to dwell forever. And this was one of the parallels to the Eden story. And so you find Eridu mentioned in the old cuneiform tablets associated with ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Sumer. And in the rite of baptism really came from the Sumerian temple city of Eridu, and of the water god Ea. And Ea, if you remember some of our past shows, is an alternate name for Enki, the god Enki, one of the Anunnaki gods. He was the god who created humanity to do the bidding of the gods, to wear the yoke of bondage of the gods, to dig their canals, to till their ground, to mine their resources. And Enki was known in Sumer as Enki, and in Akkad, the Sumer Akkadian culture, the city-state of Akkad, he was known as Ea. And interestingly enough, which we've talked about before as well, is that Ea is that name that carries through another 1,500 years to the region of Canaan, where the Israelites, the early Israelites, and the region who worshipped Jehovah, God, or Elohim at the time, Ea was the name that translated into Yahweh. Yahweh being the ancient Hebrew for Jehovah. And so Enki Ea became Yahweh in the Canaanite culture, which became Jehovah. So, he's the god of the house of water, Ea is. back in time here. And in the Hellenistic period, Ea was called Oanes. We've talked about Oanes before, which is the Greek Ionis, and Latin Johann, the Hebrew Yohanan, the English John. So several scholars have suggested, therefore, that there was never either a John or a Jesus, but only a water god and a sun god. So John being the water god, Jesus being the sun god. See how that all fits together? It's interesting when you trace the etymology of some of these names and these words. It's like when we talked about Moses before the burning bush. How the burning bush, we read that in English, that God appeared in the burning bush. I am that I am, he says. I am that I am, the people speak of. Well, I am, there is a Mesopotamian, ancient Mesopotamian, going back to the same time as Ea and Enki were worshipped, and El and the Anunnaki gods. It was a wordplay that simply meant Enki. It stood for Enki. So in essence, at the burning bush, you've got God telling Moses, when Moses asked, whom shall I say sent me? And God said, you tell them I am sent you. I am that I am, which is a play off of a Mesopotamian wordplay, which means I am Enki. I'm that God Enki they speak of. So you start to see the etymology of these words. So again, John the Baptist may have been representative of the God of the house of water, while we already just saw that Jesus was the God of the house of the sun. I'm not saying this is who they were. I'm saying this is how they were attributed to the older gods, the older way of thinking. The older, again, comes up the whole diabolical mimicry issue. Well, Satan, knowing that Jesus was going to rise, the true Son of God, the only begotten of the Father, offering salvation to the world, atonement for sins, the propitiation, the life, the death, the resurrection. All of these things about Jesus were also reflections of what had already happened in all these other gods. So the diabolical mimicry. Satan obviously rose up all these ancient gods to confuse the minds of humans when the real Son of God appeared. This was the contention put forward. Now the problem with that, the huge problem with that, is why didn't God just change things a little bit then? We've mentioned that a few times already in talking about this, so we won't get into that again. But examining the stories of John the Baptist and Jesus, we do seem to be clearly in mythological territory. Their two stories reflect each other perfectly. They both have miraculous births that are announced. John is born to an old woman, Elizabeth. Jesus is born to a young woman. John's mother is infertile. She and her husband Zechariah, who was one of the priests who served in the temple in Jerusalem, they were aged. They could never have children. She's infertile. Jesus' mother is unfertilized. John is born at the summer solstice when the sun begins to wane. And Jesus is born 6 months later at the winter solstice when the sun begins to wax again. Now again, this is the dates that were attributed to them. John the Baptist, his cousin, was born 6 months before Jesus. So whatever time of year Jesus was born. So later at the winter solstice, when the sun begins to wax again, is when Jesus is born. So hence the Baptist declaration about Jesus. John the Baptist said, "He must grow greater and I must become less." What is that? With the equinoxes, it's the dying of the season and the birth of the new season. John is born in the astronomical sign of Cancer, which for the ancients represented the sign of Capricorn. It represented the gates of the souls into incarnation. I skipped a line on my notes here. Jesus is born in the astronomical sign of Capricorn, which is for the ancients represented the gates of souls out of incarnation and into immortality. John baptizes with water, and Jesus with fire and with spirit. The birthday of Jesus is celebrated on the pagan festival of the returning sun on December 25th. The birthday of John the Baptist is celebrated in June, replacing a pagan midsummer festival of water. Baptism was a central rite in the mysteries. And as long ago as the Homeric hymns, Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, we hear that the ritual purity was the condition of salvation, and that people were baptized to wash away all their previous sins. This was the symbol. The pyramid texts show that there was a ceremonial baptism of the Egyptian pharaoh before the ceremony of his ritual birth as the embodiment of Osiris. And in some mystery rites, baptism was simply symbolized by the sprinkling of holy water on the forehead or the head or wherever. And in others it involved complete immersion being dunking beneath the water. Baptism tanks have been found in initiation halls and shrines. You go up in a Baptist church and you go up to the front, or most Protestant churches, and you'll find there's a baptismal tank that they fill up. It's up behind the altar. And they also had these in these ancient rites. At Eleusis, initiates ritually cleansed themselves in the sea. And in his initiation ceremony, after a confessional prayer, Lucius Apuleius underwent a bath of purification and later a baptism of sprinkling. In the mysteries of Mithras, initiates underwent repeated baptisms to wash away their sins. Such initiations took place in March or April, at exactly the same time that in later centuries, Christians also baptized their new converts, called catechumens. And the similarities between Christian and pagan rites were obvious to early Christians. The church father Tertullian tells us, quote, "In certain mysteries it is by baptism that members are initiated, and they imagine that the result of this baptism is regeneration and the remission of the penalties of their sins." Now, what's interesting, in the Baptist church, we were against the sprinkling or the touching of water on the forehead. Baptism is actually a transliterated word in the New Testament. Transliteration means I'm going to take the Greek word and just transpose it into English. I'm not going to translate it because there's a meaning to the word baptism. The Greek word for baptism was baptizo in the Greek, the Koine Greek. And they just took because there was controversy over it. Do we sprinkle? Do we dunk under the water by immersion? What do we do? They took away the controversy by saying, let's not take the definition of the word and translate it into English, which was baptizo means immersion, dunking beneath the water. So to avoid the controversy, because the word appears in the text, they just transliterated baptizo to baptize. And that's the word we have in the English, in the Bible. Unless you look at the meaning of the word, the definition, which is immerse or immersion. So according to Paul, again, who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, hijacking Christianity, there are 3 symbolic actions in the baptism of total immersion. This is what Paul taught. Entering the water signifies death. Immersion beneath it is the burial, and emergence from it is the resurrection. This was the symbol of immersion, or baptizo, or baptize. And this allegorical interpretation of baptism is completely in sympathy with the mystery rites, which also presented a mystical death and resurrection. So Paul was introducing the old mystical rites of the pagans. In the early church, the newly baptized were clothed in white robes, given a new name, and offered honey to eat. And likewise in the mysteries of Mithras, initiates who were spiritually reborn, becoming born again, as the New Testament said, had honey poured on their heads, and they were given a new name. They had honey poured on their hands, applied to their tongues, as it was customary to do with newborn children. And so descriptions by Christian authors of Christian baptisms are indistinguishable from the pagan rites and the descriptions of the mystery baptism in earlier days. Christian initiates went to baptism naked, and after they came out of the water, they put on white garments and walked in a procession to a basilica carrying a candle and wearing a crown. This is identical to the procession celebrating the mysteries of Dionysus at Eleusis, where initiates dressed in white, wearing a crown on their heads, carrying a torch in their hands, walked to the sanctuary singing hymns. Justin Martyr found the similarities between Christian and pagan rites of baptism very deeply disturbing. Remember, it was Justin Martyr who came up with the idea that the ancient pagan gods were the diabolical mimicry of Satan, preconceived. And so he resorted once again to the diabolical mimicry argument regarding baptism. Evil demons, he claimed, had instigated a parody of Jesus' baptism in the pagan rites. And in the mysteries, however, purification through baptism was not just by water, but also by air and by fire. Lucius Apuleius tells us that before he was deemed worthy to approach the divinity, he had to travel through all the elements. Servius wrote this: every purification is effected either by water or by fire or by air. Therefore, in all mysteries you find these three methods of cleansing. They either disinfect you with burning sulfur, or they wash you with water or ventilate you with wind. The latter is done in the Dionysic mysteries. The Gospels in the Bible also talk of a threefold elemental baptism. In the Gospel of Matthew, John the Baptist predicts the coming of Jesus, and he says this: "Now I bathe you in the water to change hearts, but the one coming after me is stronger than me. I am not big enough to carry his shoes. He will bathe you in holy breath and fire. Winnowing fan in hand, he will clean up his threshing floor and collect the grain to be put in the silo and the husks to be burned in the unquenchable fire." Now that's a slightly different interpretation than you might be used to. That was in Matthew 3, verses 11 and 12. And the baptism by fire was symbolized in the early church by immersing a blazing torch into the font, and then the early Roman church, the Pope leads the chosen ones to the baptistry, where he consecrates the water in the baptismal font by blowing over the surface of the water. The deacons then dip their candles in the water in the Missae Romanum, which is still in force today. The priest dips an Easter candle in the baptismal font, praying that it may fully impregnate this water with its power. Some of the old pagan traditions still practiced in the Catholic Church. Among the Greeks, pieces of firewood or torches lit from the altar flame were added to the lustral water, and purification by air was also used. The baptismal font of Christianity, therefore, contains the three principal elements through which the candidate for the pagan mysteries formally had to pass. Now, if that's not intriguing, I don't know what is. How much closer do you get to it than that? So, in this tradition, or this translation of this verse that I read of John the Baptist, the familiar term Holy Spirit is correctly translated from the original Greek as Holy Breath, the breath of life, which clearly brings out the idea of baptism by air. So John tells us that Jesus will wield a winnowing fan used for sieving corn. In the mysteries of Eleusis, such a fan was used in baptism by air. In vase paintings and other representations, initiates are pictured veiled and seated with a winnowing fan being waved above their heads. Dionysus was known as he of the winnowing fan. And at his birth, he was said to have been cradled in a winnowing fan, just as, symbolically, the initiate was at his spiritual rebirth in baptism. Now, I got to make a note here. We never believed in the Baptist Church and in most Protestant faiths that baptism removed the sin of the heart. Baptism had nothing to do with that. We were told that baptism was the first step of the new Christian, somebody who cognitively, consciously accepted Jesus Christ as their personal Savior and Lord. Someone who became born again was a cognitive, conscious action that a fully developed mind had to make. And one of the first commands of the new Christian was to be baptized, to show that you have an affinity with Christ, with the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Christ. It was a conscious act, and I believe it's Peter, this is off the top of my head, I think he said it's not the putting away of the filth of the flesh. No, it was James, I believe. Baptism was not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a clean conscience before God. Because you were doing what he asked to do, to symbolically identify yourself with Christianity. So now in the Catholic Church, they believe that baptism is a thing that washes the soul clean of its sin nature. It's like when they baptize babies. When we were in the fundamental Baptist Church, you didn't do that, because baptism was supposed to come after someone had consciously, cognitively accepted Jesus into their heart. How can a 7-day-old baby consciously, cognitively accept Jesus into their heart? So we looked at the literalness of that baptism wasn't the putting away of sin, it was the identification of the conscious believer. So you can go on, you can look at that any way you want. But in the same way that an initiate in the pagan mysteries was reborn through the purification by air, so Jesus promises rebirth through breath. In the Gospel of John, Nicodemus, you remember Nicodemus? Asks Jesus, how can a person be born in old age? Can he climb into his mother's belly a second time and be born? Remember, Nicodemus was one of the members of the Sanhedrin. He was a Pharisee. And he asked Jesus by night, he came to Jesus by night to ask him questions. If you're really God, I got some questions for you. And he said, what's this born again thing? And Jesus tells him, in the Old English, you may have seen it, verily, verily, I say unto thee. Well, in English, truly, truly, I tell you this. Anyone who isn't born of water and breath can never get into the kingdom of God. What's born of the flesh is flesh, and what's born of the breath is breath. Don't be amazed because I told you you have to be born again. The wind blows where it will and you hear the sound of it, but you don't know where it comes from or where it's going. It's the same with everyone born of the breath. And I want to look at this. The source on that is John 3, verses 3 through 12, if you want to look that up. So that's baptism. And we got lots of them. I wanted to start getting into the miracles of Jesus here, but I think according to my clock, I am about a minute to a minute and a half from the end of this particular episode. So tomorrow we're going to talk about the miracles of Jesus and how they compare to the miracles of the God-men in ancient pagan mysteries. And we'll save miracles for that. So let me know what you're thinking. What are you thinking about this little series? Does this open up your eyes a little bit? Does it make you question what you thought you always believed? Does it add information to what you believe you already possessed, informationally speaking? What does this do to Jesus for you? Does this make Jesus less than God? Or does this reestablish that he is the God-man? There's a lot of questions that this brings up. And so when you start looking at these pagan mysteries and looking at all the God-men that came before Jesus, you have to make the comparative and say, is Jesus just another one of them? What makes him unique amongst the God-men, outside of being able to explain it by faith alone? So there it is. I'm going to leave it in your hands. I'm going to let you mull that stuff over, and we'll talk about it some more. Thanks for all of you who came in tonight and spoke in the chat room. I appreciate your input. Thank you for your time. Thanks for being here and being part of my show. We're going to take a 23-hour break, and we'll be back right after that. Sit tight.